So it's out, so we can stream to YouTube, and people ask questions in the live chat and stuff as well sometimes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, interesting. I'll see. I'll put the video back on for now and see if it works.
Okay. Yeah, and then if it keeps kind of breaking up,
off.
we'll sort it out. Yeah, no problem. Awesome.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we're live on YouTube now then. And are you, is St. Andrews closed at the minute where you teach for half term?
It is, yeah. Yeah, right now we're on our spring break, and then we'll be going to online teaching when we come back.
Right. Yeah. And is it's history of logic that you teach, as well as like some stuff in philosophy of like economics and stuff? Is that right?
Yeah, I teach just history of philosophy generally. We have quite a few history classes. I've also taught just kind of more standard philosophy modules. But yeah, we have a philosophy of economics module that we co-teach with the economics department. So I think that's quite unique. I don't know any other places that have a joint taught course like that.
So kind of a lot of the discourse and dialectic on my channel has centered around various kind of like theistic arguments, philosophy as it's used in apologetics by people as well. But one of the things that's been really interesting to talk about, especially as we've come for like some of the arguments that center around like moral realism, and I've had a few people on talking on both sides of that, has been like logic, whether something like logic actually exists. So if metaphysical naturalism is true, what does that mean for what like logic and mathematics are? If something like idealism is true, what does that mean for these concepts and stuff? So I guess I could start off by asking you, what is logic? What do you think of when you hear that term? What kind of set of things come to mind?
Mm-hmm. So I think I have a very sort of unnaturalistic understanding of logic. I'm very influenced by the way that, well, at least as I understand it, logic was conceived of in the Cartesian revolution in philosophy. You have a few options with how to treat what appear to be logical truths, very basic things like if one thing follows from another thing and you have the first thing, then you have the other as well. You can treat these as merely formal relationships among bits of language, the language that you express them in. You can treat them as somehow reflecting facts about the physical world, even when they don't seem to be, because of course you can have logical truths about non-existent objects or about abstract objects, or you can treat them as they really appear to be to me, which is relations among abstract objects, the same way that people think about, well, mathematical Platonists think about mathematical truths, that there are just these objects, numbers, which are not ordinary objects that we encounter in the natural world. They're not things that are accessible to observation, and yet we somehow know about them. We know about them through some faculty of intuition. So I'm afraid I have the kind of spookiest theory of logic in that sense.
So in terms of like these abstract objects, so for people, a fair few of the people who kind of follow these have had kind of follow my channel have had some opposition to the more sort of idealistic or Platonist positions when it comes to mind and stuff, saying that, we're like kind of postulating these entities that we're not certain, we don't need to postulate them. It'd be, we know that there's the material world there, they would say. So we're saying that there's this extra thing, whereas we could say it's just a description that we give to those things. Well, how would you kind of, if someone's at that kind of place with their philosophy, how would you convince them that there are these abstract objects, and that something like logic is to do with them, and it's not just a description of things that humans have invented?
Okay. Well, take a relatively simple logical truth that, let's say, you have some object, call it A, and if that object has some property, F, and it has some other property, G, then it has both the properties F and G. So you can think about that in various ways, but that's something that you know to be true even before you've observed any objects, even before I tell you what object that is, even before what I tell you these properties are. So it seems like if we can know that, I mean, a scientific truth that you know about objects, you have to know by testing lots and lots of cases. You know, we'd have to go out and see, okay, well, if I find a rock that's big and I find a rock that's gray, will I always also find a rock that's both big and gray? And then we'd have to do this over and over. You know, that's just not the methodology at all that we use to discover logical truths. So it seems like what people might want to say in that circumstance is we've discovered something about the structure of thought. I mean, it's also not true about, it's not simply a truth about the mere words that we use either. It might be true that it's part of the rules of grammar that if you make a statement of a certain form, ascribing a property to a thing, and you make another statement of a certain form, property of the same name, then you have to do this other thing. But of course, names and concepts come apart. You might have two objects with the same name, and then you wouldn't have this rule applying in the same way. So it seems like it's something not about the names and not about objects in the world, but about the structure of something like concepts. That you have a relation between a concept of something and a concept of some, or concepts of some properties. And there are these connections among the concepts that obey these various rules that we identify as rules of logic. So I guess that would be my way in. It seems like we don't learn about them in the right way for them to be facts merely about the natural world around us, nor to be merely facts about language, the structure of our language.
To kind of shift gears a little bit, I suppose, on logic here, as you teach history of logic as well, could you briefly take us through kind of where logic's kind of beginnings, how it's adapted, and how we come to these sorts of positions where that people are talking about in academic fields, in universities, in computer science, things like that. Could you briefly take us through the history of logic up to now as well, just to give people kind of a vague background of these things? I know that might be asking, you know, rather a lot to briefly kind of.
Well, it just might go slightly outside of my expertise, but
Okay.
you know, I mean, a standard story that we're told in at least in the Western tradition, and I mean, one of the interesting things about the history of logic is it's so non-linear. It's not like a science that starts in one place and then, you know, slowly develops and more discoveries are made, and we just have this sort of growing snowball of knowledge. Instead, there are different periods people are using logic for different purposes and making different kinds of adjustments and discoveries, if you want to call them that, based on what their interests are. But we're often taught that the beginning is with the work of Aristotle, who devoted two entire works, at least, to the study of what we call logic. What he was calling syllogism, which he defined fairly simply as a syllogism is just a case where when something's true, then something else has to be true, or something like that. So it was the sort of science of inference, and Aristotle developed these various formal rules for working out how you could identify the form of an argument, sort of like I did there earlier, where you take out certain words and replace them with variables. And if you do this to an argument, you identify its form, you know, its skeleton. So I go from saying all humans are animals, all humans are mammals, therefore some mammals are animals, or something like that. Well, I just take the words animals, humans, and mammals and replace them with variables, and then we have the form of the proposition, all A or B, etc. I can't remember the example that I used. But so, this is the way that Aristotle thought about logic, was you can test the validity of an argument by abstracting out its terms and seeing whether what you're left with is one of the valid forms. And he had various ways of identifying what he thought the valid forms of argument were. In all through the medieval centuries, you had logic being developed in all of these different ways due to different kinds of motivations, different preconceptions. One of the most interesting periods because the motivations were quite different from our own. Sometimes you had people, particularly in the 14th century and onwards, trying to work out something like a scientific method. So, that's relatively familiar to us, but also this preoccupation with religious questions, questions involving, things that are very difficult to think about, mysteries of the Trinity, questions about reconciling God's foreknowledge with human free will. So, when does it become true that I was going to do what I choose to do right now? God knows that I'm going to do it, but it doesn't seem like it's true until I've made up my mind to do it. All these sorts of problems and paradoxes. So a lot of the medieval tradition was driven by what they called insolubilia, which were paradoxes. And so you develop these very interesting bits of apparatus to deal with these paradoxes. And then in the early modern period, things start to change again. I think for somebody like Descartes, first of all, he discovers that the formal rules that Aristotle had come up with, which were still the basis of how most people thought about logic, how logic was taught in universities. Descartes made the interesting observation that it's because we intuitively know when an argument is valid that we know that these forms are valid, not the other way around. So you can't really use the forms to tell you what a valid argument is. You only know that the forms are valid because you already know what a valid argument is. So for Descartes and for logicians that tried to cultivate Descartes' methods, logic became this exercise of honing that intuitive faculty, whatever it is. Somehow we have this faculty of intuiting when an argument is really valid. And a lot of that, I think, is interesting in the modern context because it involved something like a kind of spiritual therapy. What blinds your natural intuitive faculty for seeing validity is your own prejudices, your own desire to believe things that you want to believe, all these kinds of things. So a lot of logic, as they called it, became not a formal exercise, but a way of training yourself to see with your mind as clearly as possible, to not be blinded by prejudice and other distractions. So that becomes a kind of an interesting period, and logic develops in the modern context, partly from that foundation. And then
is it sorry to interrupt, is that period around that time, is that where your kind of specialization is as well, when we've got people like Spinoza or British empiricists and things? Is that your kind of specialization around then, or?
That is, yeah, that's the period I'm most interested in. And it's a period that's not often studied in the history of logic. I mean, for a long time, the history of logic, if you look at books written in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, even on the history of logic, you tend to have a lot on the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, and then other ancient Greek philosophers. Often you have stuff on the parallel sort of Indian tradition. Then you have lots and lots on the medieval centuries. People increasingly realize that this is an interesting period. And then you just kind of skip to the late 19th century because the early modern period was seen as a sort of dark time.
Right.
Well, in terms of formal logic, maybe it was a relatively dark time. People weren't trying to develop new formal techniques, mathematical techniques for manipulating symbols to solve logical problems the way that they had been, partly for the reason I say that logic was not conceived of so much as a formal exercise anymore. Then in the 19th century, mathematicians are increasingly interested in proofs, in explaining how mathematical proofs really work, kind of recolonize the field of logic and apply very, very complicated, rigorous formal techniques to it.
Yeah. There's I always find like so there's a textbook called like a friendly introduction to mathematical logic, and there's something similar in Volker Halbach's the Logic Manual book, and it's like you start reading these books, you get 2 or 3 chapters in, and it's like just everything is like a self-referential definition, and it takes you about 10 minutes to read a sentence because everything's so dry and trying to technically define, like every single little piece of like how a logical language works and stuff. And it's like, if you read some ancient piece versus that, it's like how did we go from this being philosophy to like this being this dry kind of a natural language. A well-formed formula is a formula that is well-formed. So like I always find it quite funny.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, also just the subject matter of logic becomes so hard to. Another example, I guess, is Raymond Smullyan's First Order Logic textbook, which is very interesting, very nice, compact, kind of accessible in its way textbook. But you could easily, I remember somebody, a non-philosopher friend of mine, picked it up and thought that it was actually about trees, about dendrology, because the only recognizable word in there really at the start is, we're going to discuss trees, and it's just the structure of trees. At no point are you really told, I think, in the course of that book that, this is supposed to be something for analyzing arguments or understanding proofs. And I guess that's partly because, there is a prevailing idea that mathematical logic isn't really about what we do when we make intuitive bits of reasoning, when we make intuitive inferences, when people argue on the internet about who's being rational and who's being led by their emotions or whatever. The mathematical logician doesn't come in to sort that out, because their expertise, you might think, is something completely different. It's about the manipulation of these formal systems.
And something
I find.
Sorry, you go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I find people like Susan Stebbing interesting on this, because she was someone who was very, very interested in public discourse and how reasoning works in public discourse, but also a competent formal logician or a teacher of formal logic. So there are these characters who try to reconcile these two, but for the most part, they almost move in parallel.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, like because it's never not really taught in the school system at all, anything like logic. I mean, you might touch on set theory if you do like A-level maths, but it's never really like the applicability of it, the usefulness of it. And I remember, for example, like I'd watch people having debates and things on YouTube, and I'd hear them using the terminology of like informal fallacies, so saying that's an ad hominem, that's a straw man and stuff like that. But I never really thought about good argumentation and how can this thing be like formalized. How do I think about how like a set of premises might lead to a conclusion, and that style of thinking isn't really taught. It wasn't until I got into philosophy and started reading things that like actually breaking down like sentence structures and thinking about like, am I actually making a valid argument here that leads to my conclusion by these laws of inference? It wasn't until philosophy came along that I started doing that. And I think it can be useful at that popular level of just thinking about things, but then it's weird how it's also applicable to, like you can build a computer based off of this stuff as well.
Yeah. In a way, I mean, it's kind of more you might say it's more useful for building computers than for actually creating arguments. So there's certainly, I mean, in terms of assessing arguments, these are the sorts of exercises we give to first-year students. You give them something from a newspaper and you say, put this argument into some kind of form. And there it's useful, you know, you can spot fallacies and things like that. But even if a mathematician learns a very advanced system of mathematical logic, that doesn't tell them how to construct proofs. I always find it interesting in teaching logic when, you know, you can teach these very simple inference rules and then people pretty quickly learn to do the relatively mechanical things, filling out truth tables and assessing the validity of arguments. But then you give them very simple formula and say, you know, now prove this. There's an algorithmic way to construct a proof with trees, but you can also say construct a natural deduction proof. And there it's purely creative. I mean, you just have to think, okay, well, I don't know what premises, I know which conclusion I need to get to. I know, you know, how to know whether a premise I'm constructing is true or not, but I don't know how to find which premises are going to lead to the conclusion I want.
Yeah, I very much don't like natural deduction for that exact reason, because it just seems it seems so arbitrary to me almost sometimes when it's like, oh, we can just introduce, you know, or introduction. We're just going to introduce a thing here. I'm just going to use this one now. And whereas like if I'm using like a tableau method, I can go down the tree and everything makes like sense. Like there are set rules and it's algorithmic. So for me, I've not found that that balance between the artistry and stuff. But I thought what could be interesting as well is the arguments in the first place. Do you think people sort of almost have a set of beliefs as philosophers, and then they use use the forces of logic to prove what they already believe is true almost as well?
I think, yeah, I mean, to a very great extent, there's, you know, this interesting research by people like Banz Thurber and Hugo Messier, the enigma of reason. You know, I'm not qualified to judge, but they use a lot of convincing sounding cognitive science to suggest that reasoning is, for the most part, a faculty that we use for justification,
right?
Not for belief formation. Part of the argument is they have this modular theory of the mind that, you know, there are so many different modules in the mind that don't really talk to each other that are responsible for actually constructing our beliefs. And this all-purpose universal faculty of reasoning is really only useful when you then want to communicate whatever it is that your mind has put together to somebody else and convince them to believe it. I think there's probably a lot in that. But of course, the period of logic I study is where logic meant a technique for belief formation. You know, it's supposed to be a way of keeping you on the path of truth.
So to go back to that period then, and say if we start with Descartes. So as you were saying, his kind of thing being less about like a formal language, a formal system, but more about what we can. Would it be right to use the language what we can clearly and distinctly perceive? Would that be the correct way of thinking about Descartes' version of logic? Yeah. What does that mean? What does he mean by that?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of interesting things there. I mean, from a certain period onwards, logicians start separating out the process of forming actual ideas, which I suppose is, as philosophy becomes increasingly empiricist, people thought that you get your ideas by just observing the world directly. There's no inferential process involved there. And inferences, which move you from one belief to the next. And these are increasingly treated as two completely different faculties. But of course, for Descartes, the interesting thing is that there's one faculty, which is clear and distinct perception. So you clearly and distinctly perceive something like your idea of yourself, and then you infer your own existence from that, not by using some different faculty from the one that you use to perceive your own existence, but just the same faculty again. And Descartes calls this intuition, at least in the rules of the direction of the mind, he calls this intuition. Later on, he's sort of unclear about what this faculty is. But one interesting thing that Descartes says is that reasoning is just a series of intuitions. So, you have intuitions that give you your premises, and then to move from your premises to a conclusion, you just have another intuition. That's the connection between the premise and the conclusion. And then you can move from the conclusion to another conclusion by the same operation again.
So yeah, I always find it strange though, because it's always like almost a stock question on some philosophy things. Is like, well, what does Descartes mean by like a clear and distinct idea? But I always find that almost the perfect mark scheme answer for that sort of thing is never, like when you actually get into what he's saying, it's not what the mark scheme wants. And I've not really figured out exactly what, like as I reflect, is it, and as I read someone like Alvin Plantinga, and he's trying to defend the Christian belief by this moderate foundationalism, this properly is it kind of like along that lines, that it's just this properly basic thing, or is it like what would be called like classical foundationalism? Is Descartes saying the thing that you perceive clearly and distinctly, you've got like to some bedrock foundation there somehow? So could you maybe elucidate some of that or clear up my misunderstanding on those fronts?
Yeah, no, I think it's a mysterious category, and it's a category that is particularly hard to explain in a modern context, because I think that Hume's fork, this idea that you either have sensory observations or you have something like analytical truths, truths that you work out just through a priori reasoning, which is a purely formal exercise of some kind. I think, even though that's not anything like a consensus view, something like the shadow of that view is still cast over a lot of analytic philosophy, that beliefs are either, they're either kind of like one of those, or they're kind of like the other. They're kind of like sensory observations, or they're kind of like, pure formal deductions found by manipulating symbols in some way. So people always want to know, well, are Descartes' clear and distinct ideas more like the sensory perceptions, or are they more like formal deductions? I think, there's a Cartesian philosopher, Arnold Gellings, I don't know, he's an idiosyncratic sort of Cartesian, but he gives as an example something. He's one of the few who's quite familiar with medieval logic, and he gives the example of a dilemma. And a dilemma is a device that you would use in these logical games to try to get people to admit some conclusion, no matter what. And, so you can't appeal to empirical evidence, because they can challenge their empirical evidence. They can say, I don't observe what you observe. So you have to use these sort of rhetorical tricks, you might think. But the one he picks is, if you say there is something true, then somebody will have a very hard time denying that. Because if they say, well, there isn't something true, then you say, well, then it's true that there is something true.
Right.
So what's interesting about that, I think, is it's not just a formal consequence. It's something that seems, at least on the face of it, to carry a metaphysical conclusion. So, I mean, there you're seeing with your mind's eye, in a way. You're feeling the presence of something, which is a truth. People, you can, of course, say there aren't really such things as truths. There are only houses and rocks and people and planets. But there's at least an initial pull towards thinking. So this looks like the direct perception of something in that sense. It's your mind's encounter with something outside of itself. The mind's grasping of a type of object, or a strange type of object. But it's, so in that sense, it's like a perception, but very much not like a sensory perception in so many other ways. I think that's probably the kind of thing that Descartes is thinking of. Spinoza has this nice phrase, the demonstrations are the eyes of the mind, which tells you something about how he views logical demonstrations. They're not simply ways of moving from something you already know to something else you don't know. They're the eyes of, they're ways of grasping things outside of the mind, a way of sort of perceiving with your mind. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, no, it helps somewhat in understanding. I think because of the kind of cultural context that I'm coming at this from, it can be so difficult to try and get at what some of these philosophers really meant by what they were saying. Like I found in reading some of Plato over Christmas, for example, that originally when I was reading Plato, I was thinking, oh, this is clearly some kind of like religious hocus pocus view over here, and this is like a weird thing, and that's just some ancient. But then as I started to really try and grasp what he was saying about things, and try and shed off like my cultural context and get at what's he trying to talk about with this world of forms. There's some really quite advanced ideas that lie behind these things about like what I would call psychology, or maybe like what I would call magnetism and stuff. And I had to appreciate how much I've been influenced by my culture to like get at this philosopher's insights into what all those things kind of mean. I think the same thing can go on with Descartes, Spinoza, and also perhaps the empiricists as well. I was wondering if you wanted to, is it like a Kantian invention, the kind of battle between the rationalists and the empiricists in this time? Would you speak to something like historically of what's going on between these seeming like groups of philosophers as they clash on these kind of ideas of whether there is this kind of a priori inner thing we can get to, or whether it's like a blank slate and everything's just coming in through the senses and the outside world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't reject the rationalist empiricist distinction to, with quite the violence that some other historians of early modern philosophy do. I mean, it's true that, these are retrospectively applied labels, and in some ways there are more differences, you might say, between Locke and Hume than there are between Locke and Descartes. But I mean, with Kant, it's quite difficult. Kant, we're taught that Kant wanted to synthesize these two positions, rationalism and empiricism, that he wanted to reconcile the idea that there are innate things that we know just because they're already in our mind, and certain things, with an empiricist kind of methodological discipline that tells you shouldn't draw conclusions except about what you can substantiate with actual observed evidence. In a way, it seems to me that Descartes' project is sort of left out of it. I don't think that Cartesianism has much to do with either of those ideas. It's true, that Descartes speaks about innate ideas, but you could just as well replace innate with something like what Spinoza says, seen with the eyes of the mind. It doesn't really matter very much whether it's in the mind to begin with. The point is that these are things that are accessed through a way of knowledge that isn't observation. That seems to me the most. And I think maybe part of the reason philosophers are uncomfortable with this is because there's always a very strong temptation for philosophers in the direction of saying that there must be things that we kind of know through direct mental intuition, not through observation. But to say that, it sounds like philosophers trying to appoint themselves above natural scientists, or setting themselves up as rivals potentially to natural scientists, kind of people who have access to this world that these poor scientists.
Do you think that is a helpful distinction to make between these kind of groups of philosophers historically, though, to say there's this empiricism project which is about stuff coming in from the outside world, a posteriori, all that, and this rationalist camp. Is that a useful distinction, or is there far too much nuance in the actual ideas that are being kind of posited by these people to do that?
Well, I think that there's, it might be that there are too many debates getting mixed up in that distinction. So there's a debate about nativism, you know, about whether the mind comes pre-packaged, if you like, with certain knowledge, the ability to learn language, or, you know, whatever, or knowledge of language's fundamental structure or something. You know, these various examples that people give, maybe mathematical knowledge is kind of innate to us. So that's one debate, although that's a debate that can to a certain extent take place within a very empiricist framework. People just trade observations. Well, if you observe empirically that people are able to know certain things without ever having made any relevant observations, and that's empirical evidence for nativism. So sometimes people treat rationalism as a type of nativism. Then there's the other, you know, quite different issue of whether the mind can grasp things, can sort of access bits of reality without having to be mediated through the senses. That seems separate again. And then I guess there are sort of Kantian debates which are almost different again. You know, they're questions about whether we have to bring to our sensory observation structures and formal relations that are not directly read off the observations themselves. So I guess I'm not against the use of dichotomies as such, but it's important to specify which one we mean.
So then maybe moving on from Descartes chronologically through the debate then, how would you say that Descartes' ideas are kind of picked up and built upon about logic and this idea of it being something that's perceived clearly and distinctly? How does that get transformed and taken forward?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there are a couple of attempts to write Cartesian logic textbooks. So one of the things Descartes was criticized for was that he didn't produce a logic, which was supposed to be something that you did as a philosopher building a big system like him. He repeatedly said that he just wasn't interested in that enterprise, but other people took up the project on his behalf. So you have a philosopher named Johannes Klauberg who writes a logic textbook published in 1656, I think. It's supposed to be on Cartesian foundation. And a lot of that is about medicine of the mind, of the sort of talking. You know, it's about working out what it is that makes us reason badly and developing techniques for helping us to reason better. So this is very practically focused. It's Cartesian in the sense that there's almost nothing formal in there at all. There are a few formal rules. But, you know, it's really interested in, first of all, the question of how we can train our minds to work the way they're meant to work. And secondly, how we can use language effectively with each other. There's a lot about communication in there and a lot about interpretation. It's an interesting book. Then there's something, the Port-Royal logic, more famous, appears, I think, in 1663. That's a strange book because on one hand, they accept the Cartesian ideas that, look, there's no formal science of logic. You can't reduce reasoning to some set of rules. But then they just go on to kind of talk about lots and lots of rules. And they use the same traditional formal technique. It sort of makes you think, well, I mean, I guess if you want to say something about logic, it's hard to know what else you can say besides right. Teaching people, you know, basic fallacies, basic formal patterns of inference, and stuff like that. But I guess, I mean, probably the biggest leap, which gets you towards Kant, is Herlinck's again, who he wants to be able to say a little bit more about what it is to clearly and distinctly perceive an inference. So Descartes just says you can clearly and distinctly perceive that one thing follows from another. Herlinck does try to give some account of that. And the account he gives is to do with concept containment. You perceive that one thing follows from another when you can see that the concept of one is contained within the concept of another. That becomes very important for Kant, and then for lots and lots of post-Kantian philosophy, because basically from that point onwards, people tend to think that logical inference means that there are these relations where, you know, one concept is contained within another. Sometimes it's obvious within the language, you know, the concept of rational animal is contained within the concept of animal, or sometimes vice versa. Containment's a tricky relation in that way. But you know, that then sort of sets the agenda. But I think, you know, Descartes, for the same reason he resists formal rules, would also resist that. I think he resists any attempt to reduce reasoning to some specific kind of easily formalizable rule or principle. It might be that sometimes when you infer one thing from another, it's because the concept containment. But
would you say perhaps in contemporary terms that what's going on with some of these people is like reducing our kind of bias when it comes to reasoning or something like that? Is that what a lot of this is kind of about?
I think a lot of the early Cartesian logic stuff was, yeah. It was, you know, since we can't formalize reasoning, we can't tell you anything about what makes it the case that one thing follows from another. All we can tell you there is that you can see it. The thing we then have to explain is, well, then how do you see it? And why do we so often not see it? And what do we do when one person sees it and one person doesn't? Things like that. Okay. You know? So that becomes the focus.
That's interesting. So then for some other kind of the heavy hitters, so to speak, of around a similar time period. So if we were to talk about the kind of Leibniz's or the Spinozas, how do their views of logic kind of compare and contrast? I mean, my understanding would be that Spinoza isn't particularly a mathematician, but he kind of ends his proofs and things with QED a lot, but someone like Leibniz is perhaps more interested in the mathematical side of things and perhaps formalizing a language and stuff, and also how are they influenced by these kind of other views that are perhaps less formal, you know, and coming to their conclusions?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, Spinoza, I guess, he, you know, although I have tremendous respect for Spinoza, he's the kind of focus of a lot of my research. I think that sometimes his thinking about logic as such, or reasoning as such, is just a bit of a mess. I mean, he takes, I think, from Herlings the concept containment idea a lot. He often sort of seems to prove his inferences by saying the concept of one thing is contained within, you know, he proves the existence of substance by saying the concept of existence is contained within the concept of substance, something like that. Other times he just sort of
You appear to have cut out for me.
tells himself rhetorical or properly logical. I lost you. Ah, you're back.
Yeah, I can hear you now. I think you cut out for me there. He borrows this kind of like something being contained within, and then it kind of cut off at that point for me. I don't know if the stream might have got it though.
Oh right, yeah. Well, you never know. It's because I was, you know, Spinoza's revenge for me making disparaging comments. Yeah, but, you know, I think the Euclidean sort of forms of proof are interesting. You know, that was a clear example of something that could not be formalizable at all. And nobody had any idea how you could formalize Euclid's geometrical proofs using something like Aristotle's formalization. So in some ways, Spinoza using that format might be a kind of nod to this Cartesian idea that, well, we just know, sometimes you just know that if I believe this thing, I have to believe this other thing. Now that you've shown me why I have to believe it, there's no kind of rule for doing that. But, you know, things like the Euclidean, the geometrical order is a kind of technique for doing that. Leibniz is a different case, much more important, I guess, for the history of logic. But Leibniz maybe picks up the other bit of what Klarberg was doing, which was to aid in communication. Another thing that logic would do is help people to understand each other. Inference is such a big part of communication. Somebody says something which has a literal meaning, then there are other things that are implied by that literal meaning. So does the person mean the things that are, often the way that you understand what somebody's saying to you is you don't listen to what they literally say, you listen to the implications of what they say. So logic is a big part of communication, mutual understanding. And Leibniz, you have a return to formalization. He defends the practice of Aristotelian syllogistic against criticisms from people like Locke, that this is actually very beautiful and intricate science. He mostly defends it on these aesthetic grounds, which is interesting enough. But then clearly, in his own work, he wants to increasingly formalize language. He has this ideal that if we make language precise enough, if we develop a logically perfect language, then most of the disputes that we have will go away. And most of the disputes we have are down to ambiguities, people talking past each other. Once you develop a language where it's impossible to talk past each other, then we can only disagree on things that, can be factually determined very quickly, one way or the other. But people give Leibniz a lot of credit for his formal brilliance as a mathematician, and that's deserved. But I find it quite hard to know what he actually wants to do. At one point, he says this thing that if we develop mathesis universalis, as he calls it, a universal kind of symbolism, then whenever people dispute, instead of shouting at each other, they'll just sit down and calculate. And I think, okay, well, that sounds good. But, if we're disputing about whether children should be allowed to vote or not, how do we solve that by sitting down and calculating? And Leibniz, rather disappointing answer is that everything, again, there's the conceptual containment idea. Everything that logically follows is down to which concepts are contained within which other concepts. So we would simply examine the concept of children and see whether it contains have the right to vote or not. And the way we would do that is because all the concepts are assigned numbers, and the numbers are the prime factors of all the concepts that compose them in Leibniz's system. So we would just find the number for have the right to vote and see whether that's a factor of the number for children. The only problem is, of course, we don't know these numbers.
Which is what we see happening every time the Westboro Baptist Church turn up at an event, they're saying, let's calculate. Look, guys, we've got the calculations.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said that's exactly how we see people, resolving these sorts of disputes today when we've got a kind of formal logic system. You see the Westboro Baptist Church turning up at a rally and saying, look, it's all here in the proof, guys. We've got, you don't see people
right, yeah. Well, so, I guess if Leibniz had finished, the list of all the concepts, if he had assigned a number to each of them, then maybe we could do that. But.
So is there anything else you think that for people it's kind of who are coming to this maybe for the first time, especially this period, and they want to pull things out of what its implications are for logic as well? Are there any other kind of key influences that we've missed in that period overall on how people are thinking about logic, how its influence and so forth?
Well, I mean, I guess another thing that's worth mentioning is that throughout the whole early modern period, one thing that you'll read sometimes when you read logic textbooks or history of logic books is that the early modern period can be written off because it was mostly psychologism, which was, Gottlob Frege's disparaging term for a type of mathematics that he didn't like, but people apply it to systems of logic, where logic is just the science of how we think. And so there's this idea, and to some extent you do have this for Locke, for example. He says, again, he disparages Aristotle. He says that these formal rules don't really tell you anything very useful, that reasoning is really just seeing the connections between concepts. But then the examples he gives are kind of like word association, almost. They look like psychological associations. So I can't remember exactly, but he's something like, you can prove that God is just by thinking God, and then that makes you think of punishing the sinful, and then by thinking of the sinful, you think of those who deserve punishment, and then punishing those who deserve punishment makes you think of justice, and so this kind of thing. So I guess there is a strong tendency within this whole period to maybe, I don't know if get confused is the right word, but there's a lot of moving between looking at psychological laws of association, the sorts of connections that we just tend as a species to make, and looking at rules of logical inference, what actually follows from what else. Obviously, when you get to 19th century forms of idealism, then that's suddenly seen as a great advantage, that finally they can solve this riddle of whether logic is about connections between truths or just associations we make in our beliefs. Well, if truth just is what people believe collectively, if you have that kind of idealistic view, then now you can suddenly identify these two things. Psychology and logic become one and the same. But yeah, I suppose that's another thing worth noting about this period. I don't think it's true that everyone during this period was psychologistic in that sense, but certainly there were tendencies.
As we, I suppose, continue to move through a little bit, then maybe onto like Frager and Russell's sort of view of logicism, if that's the right term to apply. What do you make of that kind of project? Is it to sort of define all of mathematics in terms of basic logical truths or set theory from George Cantor or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think Frege was just happily Platonist to some extent. Frege, thought, well, when you think about objects like apparent objects, like the fact that the sun is round, where is that located? Well, it's not located anywhere. When is it true? Well, it's always true. Even before there was a sun, it was going to be true that the sun is round at this particular time. And then, these sorts of things are made up of concepts. His theory of truth as well was just there to seize abstract objects, truth and falsity. So the motivation for Frege in reducing mathematics to logic was just to have decidable proofs. That was the goal, is if you can reduce all of mathematics to some simple set of logical rules plus certain axioms, then mathematics is perfectly decidable. You need no longer have mathematical controversies. A bit like Leibniz, maybe, in that sense. Russell is a different kind of project. I mean, for him, the idea that you could reduce mathematics to logic would mean that mathematics, he says, is the subject where we don't know what we're talking about. Because mathematics is just, for him, was supposed to be just a set of the most general possible truths that would apply to all objects, no matter what. So, 1 + 1 = 2. It's not about numbers. It just doesn't matter what it's about. So there, I guess you have this idea that, again, sort of a holdover from an empiricist period, to a certain extent. John Stuart Mill has this kind of idea as well, that logical truths are just laws of nature on steroids. Laws of nature are pretty general, but you can go more general again. You can have, the law of gravity applies to basically any physical object, but the law of non-contradiction applies to any kind of object whatsoever. So, different sorts of projects there.
And is that are these sorts of positions still something that people tend to kind of hold to today from that period, or have things kind of moved on since then? And I was gonna get into a bit of kind of Vic and Stein and maybe the School of Vienna after maybe you answer that question as well.
Yeah. The honest answer is I don't know. I
Sure.
don't know enough about how the fields of philosophical logic have developed. I mean, I guess it's a pretty common view now that logic has no ontology.
Right. Okay.
It's not about anything. So it's not about things in the most general sense, nor is it about abstract objects. One way to cash that out, I guess, would be to go sort of Wittgensteinian and just say, you shouldn't take this bit of language and try to model it on a different bit of language. So we have one bit of language, which is the nouns and verbs that we use to talk about real things going on in the world, to refer to objects and say what processes these objects are undergoing. Just the bit of language where we express logical truths, the bits of language that logicians are using just don't work like that. So don't confuse yourself by trying to make them work like that. I mean, that's one way that you can go. I guess, maybe it de facto becomes a position when you have specialization to the extent that we have now within the academy, that somebody who just works in logic, just works on seeing whether one formal system can be implemented within another and so on, is not usually called upon to explain the metaphysics of what they're doing,
right,
or
sure,
anything like that. So
so then
de facto they're in a different language game.
So I was going to say for the kind of period following on from Russell with people like Vic and Stein, and then perhaps the sort of A.J. Ayer types as well, the verificationists and so forth. How does logic, what it means, change for these people, and how is that influenced by these previous views?
Oh, I see. Yeah. I guess I think, the kind of Viennese tradition is peculiar and sort of historically unique. And sometimes I think very hard for non-specialists like me to comment on accurately, because it's really tempting to read it through the way that we're usually taught it within the Anglosphere, which is via people like A.J. Ayer.
Right.
Ayer is in this kind of British tradition, again, coming from the tradition of John Stuart Mill, I suppose, where you have this kind of very strong empiricism. Empiricism is the default position, and any departure from empiricism is going to have to be a cost to what you're doing. So Ayer, of course, has to allow that there are certain statements whose meaning is not their empirical confirmation. Logical truths are among those. And so he minimizes the damage by making them analytic, purely analytic. These are in a way not really truths, because something that's true in virtue of meaning isn't, it's not something you're proposing to somebody else to accept or not accept. It's a convention that governs our ways of proposing things to each other to accept and not accept. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. I'm trying to pull questions from the chat simultaneously into the thing as well. So
oh yeah,
that's one. So then I suppose coming through from that period to, and I guess you were saying a bit before, you couldn't comment on everything, but is it the predominant position then now would be maybe that there isn't even necessarily any ontology connected to these things. Are people still really arguing or thinking about this stuff, or is it more now as we think about logic, is it just about almost pragmatically how can we use it to make faster computers and so stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of work on logic as such, and you know, I mean, I suppose that there's some kind of radical revisionary work, people looking at some of the deeper foundations of logic and seeing what happens if you move some of them around. So if we can allow certain things to be neither true nor false, we get different kinds of logic. You know, what can we do with that? If we allow certain things to be both true and false, we get different kinds of logic. What can we do with that? But I guess that in itself sort of tells you that the attitude is pragmatic in the sense that you say, there's a lot of stuff on logical pluralism. There are people who refute logical pluralism, who say, no, there has to be one true logic. But I think it's very different from the era when it was just taken as given that, you know, there's the logic of God's mind. There's the logical language that God speaks, and you know, we can argue about whether human logics are plural or not, but there's got to be this one that's just
right,
fundamental. I think that's a big difference, because it's harder to think, much harder now to think of logic as, you know, just a straightforward science where we're trying to intuit fundamental truths about the world of this very special character. It looks much more like a kind of engineering project, I guess, taking a very broad and fairly ignorant survey.
So I was trying to find, I'm sure the first time I went across to your website, there was something that I read where you said about the importance of philosophy now being to provide people with something, and I can't remember what that something was, to provide people with, it was something along the lines of like hope or a positive worldview or something, but I can't quite, or maybe I've just imagined this. Do you know what I'm talking about there? I was going to ask you a question about that.
Oh, yeah. No, there was something I remain interested in, which is, and this gets back to your question about this distinction between rationalism and empiricism. I think that sometimes, a lot of the time, we're taught that rationalists are and empiricists are these people who had these two rival ways of understanding the world, you know, as if there were two sort of different scientific methods or something. There are some people who thought we should learn about the world through observation. There were other people who thought we should consult our innate ideas. But it's very important to me that a lot of rationalists are motivated by a kind of quasi-religious project, that, you know, the idea that the mind can penetrate into realms of reality that are not observable, you know, gives some of the same things that straightforward or more mainstream religion gives. It allows people to retain hope in the face of observed pain and suffering. And, you know, I mean, the world as it appears to kind of untutored observation can look really pretty bleak. If you read books like David Benatar, you know, where he sort of says, look, if you take a really, really honest look and apply, you know, really strict empiricist methods, you don't sort of bias the data or overlook the bits that you don't like, you know, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that the world is just a very dark place. Existence is quite... So I think a lot of rationalists were motivated by that. I think, well, you know, is there more than just the empirical evidence that we should be paying attention to? So it's a mistake to think that they were just natural scientists who thought that we had helpfully had these innate ideas to to give us
Okay.
a few shortcuts.
So questions from the chat then. So one from when you were talking about in that kind of early modern period, someone asked that kind of perceived sense of logic, is it related to conscience at all by any of these writers? And I'm not sure if they were talking about like specifically from maybe like a Christian point of view or something like that.
To conscience, that's interesting. I think probably yes. I mean, one of the interesting things about Descartes' meditations is that it's structured a lot. I mean, it mirrors the structure of devotional literature. There are 6 meditations because you meditate for 6 days to imitate God's creation of the earth. And the 7th day you rest. And this devotional literature was supposed to allow conscience to speak to you, to sort of render your intellect passive so that you would be more receptive to this divine. There's something very similar about Descartes' approach to reasoning, I guess, or clear and distinct perception, that you use doubt to quieten down these leaps that you're inclined to make too easily, to kind of damp down your prejudices. Increasingly, you become more and more passive, I think, as you go through the meditations. It's not that it's not a set of proof. It's very different, say, from Spinoza. You're not kind of told to think this and then think that and then think that. You're given all these techniques to kind of stop yourself thinking the things you normally think, so that you're then open to. So I suppose Cartesian logicians, such as they were, borrow a lot of these devotional techniques that people use for kind of clarifying their religious vision, or making themselves receptive to the Holy Spirit, or however they thought about it. Yeah, that's an interesting connection. That's assuming they meant conscience in the religious sense.
Yeah, I think they did, from knowing, I can't remember who it was who asked it, but I think it was one of the Christians who subscribes to me. Someone put, I see Prof. Alexander D has an interest in fake news. I wonder if Prof. Alex is aware of the Rothschilds' interest in Reuters and how they disseminate the news to AP, which share it with their affiliates, seems corrupt. So a kind of Rothschild conspiracy theory thing here. I don't know what your thoughts are of that.
I don't know. I know nothing about this. I'm afraid.
I think that's an all right answer to give on that one. Someone said, cause and effect is logic in action. The whole universe is made by cause and effect. So isn't logic the first principle of creation, i.e. the thing by which everything else is made? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Right. I mean, that's a very Spinozist view by the sound of it. I'd say the consensus view among contemporary analytic philosophers would be absolutely not that the relation between cause and effect is not a logical relation. If it were, we should be able to work out which causes will have which effects purely deductively. But in fact, we have to observe precisely because it's a contingent relation. But yeah, people challenge that. Spinoza definitely seems to assimilate causal relations to logical ones, because for him, everything that happens is, he says that God's intellect and God's will are one and the same, right? So for God to think that something is true is also for God to make it true. Well, how does God decide what to do? Well, he just goes, he's logically perfect. He just deduces consequences. So causal relations in the world are the same as logical relations, but I don't think there are many other people who think that. So it's nice to know that there's a possible Spinozist out there.
Is Spinoza's, like I often hear people say, like Spinoza's God is nature. What could you kind of unpack what that kind of means a little bit? And you said there about kind of the will and the intellect of God. What is Spinoza's God? Is Spinoza's God even really like a God, or is it just nature? What's he even talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, logic of a sort is so important to Spinoza because it's just about the only way that we can understand God. He says that God is nature. He says that will and intellect don't belong to the essence of God at all. So you can't think of God as a being that decides, that wants to do certain things and does them, has no volitions of that sort, and doesn't have an intellect either, in the sense of forming ideas of things. So for Leibniz, for example, you have this idea that God represents all these different possible worlds, and then because he's good, he chooses to make the best one. So as God could do neither of those. He couldn't represent different possible worlds because he doesn't have an intellect, or it doesn't have an intellect, and couldn't choose one of them because it doesn't have a will. So instead, you just have this kind of grinding out of just the consequences of this infinite nature. I mean, different people have different views of what this could possibly mean. The expression I use at one point is that for Spinoza, God is like all motor and no steer, right? Just generates reality, but with no particular direction to it and no exercise of control over it at all. I think probably Spinoza thinks that every possibility is realized somewhere or other, simply because you have this being that has the power to realize possibilities, but neither intellect nor will to direct which ones get selected, just realizes all of them. I don't know.
No, that's great. Thanks for that. So I don't know how much time you've got, by the way. I've got 3 more questions lined up at the minute, if that's about right for you time-wise and stuff.
Yeah, sure, I can do 3 more.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what makes a philosopher's position true? Someone's asked.
I don't know, man. That's a question for someone who definitely identifies as a philosopher, and I, for the most part, identify as a historian. I mean, I do think that truth is unanalyzable. There's this interesting stuff that was going around on the internet, kind of the intellectual dark web crowd, talking about the correspondence theory of truth, that anyone who believes in objective truth must believe that that truth is correspondence between propositions and facts, or something like that. This surprised a lot of people working in philosophy because that's not a very accepted position anymore, really. The problem with trying to define truth is that the definition always becomes circular. So I say, okay, for something to be true is for it to correspond to some fact. Then you say, so is it true that something is true when it corresponds to some fact? Well, what fact does that correspond to? It seems like you have to presuppose the definition to be able to make sense of it. So a warning against trying to define truth, I guess.
Okay. So the second to last question then, everything that exists has ontology. Being follows the rules of logic. How can one then say logic doesn't? I'm not 100% sure what that's asking, if you've understood it. Everything that exists has ontology. Being follows the rules of logic. How can one say logic doesn't exist?
Yeah, no, I think I understand. I think this might be in relation to what I said about logic having no ontology. And yeah, that is the puzzle. I mean, there are naturalists about logic. Penelope Maddy, for example, gives this very complicated argument to try to explain, to try to support the view that logical truths really are truths about things in the world. They're about stuff. But you know, I mean, if people look at it, they can see how hard a task she sets herself trying to substantiate that view. But on the other side, yeah, I mean, if you say that logic has no ontology, then you're left with, in the same way that people say that mathematics is about numbers, not about the world, you then have, well, why do all these mathematical equations work for predicting real natural events? You know, why can we launch space shuttles using mathematics? Maybe there's a similar equivalent problem with logic, that if logic isn't telling us facts directly about the world, then how come we can use logic to make predictions and things like that? But the answer a lot of philosophers give is you can't. Just using purely logical truths isn't going to get you to any substantive knowledge about the world at all. Rationalists think otherwise, you know, rationalists of my kind think otherwise, but only because they think that logic is revealing to you a part of reality that we don't normally observe.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for that. And then the last question, which is from Millen, who has just been accepted to study philosophy and theology at Oxford. And so he's saying, if you've got time at the end of the stream, ask for some advice for a soon-to-be philosophy/theology undergrad like him.
In which country is this? Sorry.
In this country. So he's been accepted. I don't know why I couldn't pronounce the word then. Accepted to Oxford for philosophy and theology. And whenever I've had people who are in academia on, he's asked what kind of advice they'd give like a soon-to-be undergrad in those sorts of fields.
Oh, yeah. I think that, you know, one thing that I tell people is a lot of students go into subjects like philosophy and theology and encounter people who seem to have much more knowledge and end up getting intimidated, you know, because people know this sort of terminology that they don't know, or know jargon that they don't know, or more importantly, just have a position on everything already. You know, so this is my position on the mind-body problem. This is my position on whether logic has an ontology or something. I think my main advice is, first of all, don't be intimidated by that. And secondly, remember that almost everyone I know who progresses through philosophy ends up shedding positions faster than acquiring them. So, you know, it doesn't work like other subjects where the more you know about chemistry, the more you'll have opinions on various things. It's almost the opposite for philosophy. It's usually, you know, you can have these opinions that are sort of scaffolding to hold up the edifice while you're learning things, and then, you know, you lose them as you go along because you realize that things are much less clear-cut, much harder to defend. It's much more interesting, you know, that Richard Feynman quotation. I'd rather, not that I'm generally a Richard Feynman fan, but it's a good quotation, I think, where he says, I'd rather live not knowing than have answers that might be wrong. That's maybe the right attitude to take into learning philosophy.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on to talk about these things, and maybe I'll have you on again at some point if you'd want to further talk about things around that kind of time period that you specialize in, if people have got more questions or whatever.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
Is there anywhere that you'd like to kind of promote if people want to read more of your stuff, or can like get in touch with you that you want out there?
Well, if people go on my website, I guess they can find links to most of my work and contact details. If they'd like to email me, I'm always happy to
awesome.
try my
Okay.
best to answer questions that people have. Yeah.
Well, I'll put
thank you so much.
Those links in the description then, so people can see those when the video's fully up. And yeah, just thanks for coming on and doing this on, because like some random stranger kind of asking you on the internet to come and have a chat about these things can be a bit strange for some people, I guess.
Oh, no, I appreciate it.
Right.
No, it was a great conversation. Thanks very much.
No problem. So I'll end the live stream in a second. It just lags behind like 5 seconds. So